de revised. Industrial doors of Fire Station 55 in downtown Chicago were usually a threshold between chaos and safety. But on this particular rainy Tuesday, they served as a barrier against the relentless gray drizzle blanketing the city. Inside, the atmosphere was a mix of stale coffee, diesel fumes, and the comforting aroma of cheap, instant macaroni and cheese. Paul, a 34-year-old firefighter with soot permanently etched into the creases of his hands and a weary kindness in his eyes, sat at the long, scarred wooden table in the break room. He wasn't alone. Huddled around him were 3 6-year-old boys, Jack, Tyler, and Ryan. They were identical, skinny for their age, with messy brown hair and clothes that were clean but clearly secondhand, slightly too large for their small frames. Paul was in the middle of serving them lunch, scraping the bright orange pasta from a battered pot onto 3 chipped ceramic plates. It was a humble meal, the kind that costs less than a few dollars to make, but the boys looked at it as if it were a feast fit for kings. The station was quiet, most of the crew out on a minor call or sleeping in the bunk room, leaving Paul alone with his secret charges. He had been smuggling them into the station for the past 3 weeks during his lunch breaks. Ever since their elderly babysitter had been hospitalized, leaving Paul, their unofficial foster father, scrambling for childcare while he worked his shift, he knew was against regulations. He knew that if the battalion chief walked in, he'd be written up. But he also knew that these boys had nowhere else to go. Just as Jack, the boldest of the 3, reached for his plastic fork, the heavy metal side door of the station swung open with a violent clang that echoed through the cavernous garage. The sound was so sharp and authoritative that the boys froze, their eyes widening in unison. Paul instinctively stood up, positioning his broad frame between the door and the children. Entering the station wasn't a colleague or a lost tourist. It was a man who looked entirely out of place amidst the fire trucks and turnout gear. He was wearing a bespoke charcoal suit that likely cost more than Paul made in 3 months, his Italian leather shoes clicking sharply against the concrete floor. This was William Jones, a 40-year-old real estate tycoon and tech investor known throughout the state for his ruthless business tactics and his icy, impenetrable demiano. William owned half the city blocks in the district, including the land the fire station sat on, which he had been threatening to redevelop into luxury condos for months. He was supposed to be in a board meeting, but instead, he was here, looking for the chief to deliver a final eviction warning personally. His eyes, cold and assessing, swept over the garage before landing on the break room scene. He didn't see a hero feeding hungry children. He saw a violation of city property and a liability. William stepped into the break room, the smell of his expensive cologne instantly clashing with the scent of the macaroni. He looked at Paul with a mixture of disdain and confusion, his lip curling slightly as he glanced at the cheap food on the table. He didn't speak immediately. He just stared, his silence more intimidating than any shout. Paul swallowed hard, his heart pounding against his ribs, but he didn't back down. He kept his hand resting protectively on Tyler's shoulder. William finally spoke, his voice low and smooth, like gravel wrapped in velvet. He demanded to know why a municipal building was being used as a daycare center for street urchins, his words cutting through the air with precision. He accused Paul of misappropriating city resources, pointing a manicured finger at the pot of pasta as if it were evidence of a major crime. Paul tried to explain, his voice steady but respectful, that he was on his break and that the food was paid for out of his own pocket. But William wasn't listening. The millionaire was already pulling out his phone, ready to call the mayor and have the entire shift fired for incompetence and unauthorized civilian presence. However, as William stepped closer to the table to get the badge number off Paul's uniform, the 3 boys, terrified by the stranger's aggression, huddled together. Ryan, the shyest one, looked up at the looming figure of the millionaire with wide, watery eyes. It was in that split second that the air in the room seemed to vanish. William froze. His phone slipped from his fingers and clattered onto the table, landing in the bowl of macaroni, but he didn't even notice. He was staring at the boys. Specifically, he was staring at their eyes. The triplets had a rare genetic anomaly called heterochromia 1. That was a deep, soulful brown, and the other was a piercing, icy blue. It was a condition so specific, so incredibly rare, that the chances of seeing it in 3 unrelated children were statistically impossible. But it wasn't just the statistics that made William's face drain of all color. It was the fact that he saw those exact eyes every time he looked in the mirror. For 6 years, William Jones had lived in a self-imposed prison of grief. He had become a cold, unfeeling machine because it was the only way to survive the tragedy that had destroyed his life. 6 years ago, His beloved wife, Jennifer, had gone into premature labor with his mother Barbara Brown, a domineering matriarch who cared more about the family as public image and strength than anything else, had been at the hospital while William was stuck on a transatlantic flight, desperately trying to get back. By the time he landed, it was all over. Barbara had met him at the hospital entrance, dressed in black, and told him that Jennifer had died from complications and that the baby's 3 fragile boys had been stillborn. She had handled the cremation herself, she said, to spare him the pain of seeing their tiny, lifeless bodies. William had buried empty urns. He had mourned a family he never got to hold. And now, standing in a fire station that smelled of diesel and cheese, he was looking at 3 6-year-old boys who shared his face, his chin, and his unmistakable eyes. The room spun. The arrogance washed away, replaced by a terrifying, suffocating hope. Paul watched the transformation in the millionaire with confusion. He saw the man's hands trembling. William reached out, his fingers hovering inches from Ryan's face, afraid that if he touched him, the boy would dissolve like a mirage. He whispered a question that sounded more like a prayer, asking who these children were. Paul, sensing that the dynamic had shifted from a disciplinary issue to something far more profound, answered cautiously. He explained that he wasn't their biological father. He told William that he was a first responder who had found them 6 years ago. It hadn't been a standard surrender. He had found them abandoned in a cardboard box behind the station during a torrential storm. 3 tiny infants wrapped in nothing but thin hospital blankets, blue with cold and barely breathing. The system was overloaded, and Paul, who had grown up in foster care himself and knew the horrors of being separated, had fought tooth and nail to become their emergency foster guardian, eventually gaining permanent custody because no one ever came forward to claim them. As Paul spoke, detailing the struggle of raising 3 boys on a firefighter's salary, the nights spent awake with sick fevers, and the constant fear of not having enough, William felt a rage building inside him that was hotter than any fire Paul had ever fought. The timeline matched perfectly. The storm matched the night of their birth. The hospital blankets, Paul mentioned. William grabbed Paul by the shoulders, his grip like iron, demanding to know if there was anything else found with them. Paul hesitated, then nodded. He went to his locker and retrieved a small, water-damaged locket that had been tucked into the blanket of the smallest baby. He handed it to William. William opened it with shaking hands. Inside was a tiny, faded picture of him and Jennifer on their wedding day, locket he had given her just hours before he left for his business trip. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. These were his sons. They were alive. They had been stolen from him, thrown away like trash, and left to die in the cold. And the person responsible was the only other person who had been at the hospital that night. William collapsed onto the wooden bench opposite the boys. The locket clutched so tightly in his hand that the metal edges bit into his skin. The silence in the fire station was heavy, broken only by the rhythmic dripping of rain against the garage door. Paul, realizing the gravity of the situation, sat down slowly, signaling for the boys to keep eating. He didn't know this man's full story, but he recognized the look of a man whose world had just been shattered and reassembled in an instant. William looked up, tears streaming down a face that hadn't shown emotion in half a decade. He looked at Paul not as a subordinate or a nuisance, but as the man who had saved his life, or at least the part of his life that mattered most. Paul paused, looking at the boys who were now happily chasing the last noodles around their plates. He spoke the truth. He told William that the first few months were hard, that they were malnourished and had respiratory issues from the exposure, but they were fighters. He told him about their first steps in the bunk room, their first words, and how they would pretend the fire truck was a spaceship. He painted a picture of a childhood that, while poor in material wealth, was rich in love and safety. But the tender moment was cut short by the vibration of William's phone on the table. It was his mother, Barbara. Seeing her name on the screen ignited a cold, dark fury in William's eyes. He picked up the phone and, with a terrifying calmness, told her to meet him at Fire Station 55 immediately. He said there was a legal emergency regarding the property that required her signature. It was a trap. Barbara, who managed the family's legal holdings, agreed to come at once. While they waited, William didn't leave the boy's side. He took off his expensive suit jacket and rolled up his sleeves, revealing forearms that hadn't held a child in years. He sat next to Jack and hesitantly asked if he liked the macaroni. Jack, sensing the change in the scary man's demeanor, nodded and offered him a plastic forkful. William took a bite of the soggy, lukewarm pasta, and to him, it tasted better than any Michelin star meal he had ever eaten. It was the taste of time he had lost, time he was now desperate to reclaim. 20 minutes later, A sleek black sedan pulled up to the station. Barbara Brown stepped out. She was a woman in her late 60s, impeccably dressed in pearls in a stiff designer suit, her hair coiffed to perfection. She walked into the station with an air of entitlement that made the air feel thin. She spotted William sitting at the jagged table and began to scold him for choosing such a filthy location for a meeting. She didn't look at Paul, and she barely glanced at the children, dismissing them as background noise. But then, as she drew closer, one of the boys, Tyler, turned to look at her. The moment Barbara locked eyes with the child, she stopped dead in her tracks. Her purse slipped from her shoulder. The color drained from her face so rapidly she looked like a wax figure. She recognized them instantly. She had seen them moments after they were born, before she had ordered the nurse whom she had bribed heavily to take them away. William stood up slowly. He didn't yell. He didn't scream. He simply held up the locket. Barbara's mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. She tried to stammer a denial, claiming it was a coincidence, a trick, a setup by this fireman to extort money. She pointed a shaking finger at Paul, accusing him of kidnapping. It was a desperate, vicious lie, but it was all she had left. William walked toward her, his steps echoing in the silent garage. Barbara, realizing she was cornered, let her mask slip. Her face twisted into a sneer of contempt. She confessed. She screamed that she did it for him. She said that sickly, premature triplets would have been a burden. She claimed she did what was necessary to prune the family tree, to ensure he remained focused and powerful. She viewed the lives of 3 innocent children as nothing more than a bad business investment that needed to be liquidated. The cruelty of her words hung in the air like toxic smoke. Poe stood up, ready to physically throw her out if necessary, his protective instincts flaring. But William held up a hand. This was his battle. He looked at the woman who had raised him, the woman he had trusted, and he saw a monster. He told her, in a voice devoid of any warmth, that she was no longer his mother. He told her that she was stripped of a title in the company, her access to the family accounts, and her place in his life. He told her that his lawyers were already drafting the paperwork to turn over every shred of evidence regarding the falsified death certificates and the bribery to the district attorney. She wasn't just fired from the family, she was going to prison. Barbara tried to lunge at him, screaming that he was ungrateful, that he owed her everything. But William just turned his back on her. He walked back to the table, sat down next to his sons, and resumed eating the macaroni. The indifference was the ultimate insult. Barbara was escorted out by security, her screams fading into the rain, leaving the station peaceful once more. The emotional toll of the confrontation left William drained, but as he looked at the boys, he felt a lightness he hadn't known in years. However, the reality of the situation began to set in. He was a stranger to them. Paul was their dad. William knew he couldn't just uproot them, take them to his mansion, and expect everything to be fine. He looked at Paul, really looked at him, and saw the fear in the firefighter's eyes. Paul was terrified that this millionaire, with all his power and lawyers, was going to take the boys away. He knew he couldn't win a custody battle against the Jones. William saw this fear and made a decision. He wasn't going to be the man his mother wanted him to be. He wasn't going to conquer and take. He was going to build. He turned to Paul and spoke softly, asking about the station's financial troubles, asking about the boys' school, asking about Paul's life. He began to weave a plan, not of separation, but of integration. The weeks following the revelation were a blur of legal meetings, DNA tests, and quiet dinners at the fire station. The DNA results, of course, confirmed what William's heart already knew. Jack, Tyler, and Ryan were his biological sons. But the piece of paper was just a formality. The real work was bridging the gap between two worlds. Barbara Brown was indicted on multiple charges, including fraud, kidnapping, and child abandonment. The scandal rocked the city, but William shielded the boys from the media storm with the ferocity of a lion. He used his resources not to hide the truth, but to protect their privacy. He bought the entire block surrounding the fire station, not to demolish it for condos, but to create a buffer zone. He canceled the eviction notice for the station and instead funded a complete renovation, turning it into the most state-of-the-art facility in Chicago. But his most important investment was in his relationship with Paul. William understood that biology made him a father, but love had made Paul a dad. To tear the boys away from the only parent they had ever known would be a second abandonment, a cruelty he refused to inflict. Instead of a custody battle, William proposed a unique arrangement. He filed for legal co-guardianship with Paul retaining primary physical custody for the time being while the boys got to know William. But he went further. William realized that his empty mansion was a mausoleum of bad memories. He didn't want to raise his sons there. He wanted them to have the grounding and the community that Paul had given them. So William did the unthinkable for a man of his stature. He bought a modest, large house just 2 streets away from the fire station and moved in. He traded his penthouse view for a view of the playground. The transition wasn't without its bumps. The boys were initially shy around Mr. William, confusing his desperate desire to spoil them with strangeness. They didn't want expensive toys. They wanted Paul to read them bedtime stories. William had to learn that he couldn't buy their affection. He had to earn it. He traded his Italian suits for jeans on the weekends. He learned how to fix a bike chain. He learned that Tyler was allergic to strawberries and that Ryan needed a nightlight. There were evenings of awkward silence and moments where William felt like an intruder in his own children's lives. But Paul was the bridge. Paul, who could have been bitter or jealous, saw the genuine effort William was making. He encouraged the boys to trust him. He invited William to school plays and soccer practice. Slowly, the walls came down. The climax of their emotional journey came 6 months later, on the boys' 7th birthday. It was the first birthday William had ever celebrated with them. He wanted to throw a gala, a massive party with ponies and clowns, but Paul advised against it. Pizza and movies at the station, Paul had suggested. William agreed, though he couldn't resist buying them each a new bicycle. The party was held in the same break room where they had met. The station was decorated with streamers, and the entire crew was there. As the boys tore into their presents, laughing and screaming with joy, William stood back, watching them. He felt a hand on his shoulder. It was Paul. "You did good, William," the firefighter said. It was the first time they had spoken not as partners in a legal arrangement, but as equals, as friends. William looked at Paul and realized that he hadn't just found his sons. He had found a brother. He had lost his biological family to greed and lies, but he had found a real family in the most unexpected place. Barbara passed away in prison a year later, alone and unvisited. William received the news with a quiet solemnity. He didn't rejoice, but he didn't mourn her loss. He mourned the person she could have been if she had chosen love over pride. He took the boys to her grave not to honor her, but to close the chapter. He explained to them, in simple terms, that greed makes people sick, and that family isn't about whose blood you have, but who stays when it rains. Standing there in the cemetery, holding the hands of his 3 sons, with Paul standing beside them, William finally let go of the last remnants of his anger. He realized that the disaster of his life, the lunch interruption, the rain, the cheap macaroni, had been his salvation. The story ends 1 year after that day. The scene is the fire station kitchen again. It's raining outside. William walks in, but this time he's wearing a casual jacket and carrying a grocery bag. Paul is at the stove. The boys are doing their homework at the table. William unpacks the bag. He's brought ingredients for grandma mac and cheese, a playful nod to the day they met. The boys cheer as he starts to cook. It's an unconventional family, a patchwork of tragedy and rescue. But as they sit down to eat, passing plates and sharing jokes, the warmth in the room is undeniable. They raise their glasses milk for the boys, water for the Millionaire toast, not to wealth or power or the Jones legacy. They toast to yellow rice and macaroni, the humble meals that saved them. 2 years had passed since the rain-soaked afternoon. That changed everything. At Fire Station 55, the station itself had become a local landmark, not just for its shiny red trucks, but for the story that lived within its walls. The yellow rice and macaroni dinners had become a monthly tradition where the community gathered, funded by William Jones, who had traded his reputation as a ruthless tycoon for that of a philanthropic, if slightly overprotective, father. The triplets Jack, Tyler, and Ryan were now 8 years old, thriving in a world where they had 2 dads, Dad William, who taught them math and how to tie a tie, and Pop Paul, who taught them how to slide down the pole safely and the value of a hard day's work. The shadow of Barbara Brown and the dark past seemed to have finally lifted, but peace, as William was learning, is often just the intermission between storms. It was a crisp autumn Friday. William was at the station, helping Paul wax the main engine. He was wearing oil-stained coveralls, a sight that would have made his former board of directors faint. The boys were in the loft, laughing as they played a video game. The atmosphere was light, filled with the easy banter of 2 men who had become brothers in arms. Suddenly, the spell was broken by the arrival of a sleek, silver sports car that roared into the station's driveway, blocking the exit. William frowned, wiping his hands on a rag. He recognized the car model. It was ostentatious, aggressive, the kind of car he used to drive. A man stepped out. He was tall, blonde, and strikingly handsome, wearing a linen suit that looked effortless. He removed his sunglasses and scanned the garage with a smirk that made Paul's hackles rise immediately. The stranger didn't ask for the chief. He asked for William Jones. William stepped forward, his protective instinct already flaring. "I'm Jones," he said, his voice low. The stranger smiled, extending a hand that William ignored. "Mark Anderson," the man said, his voice dripping with false charm. "I believe we have some unfinished business regarding..." The air left the garage. William felt the blood drain from his face. Paul stepped up beside him, crossing his huge arms. "You got the wrong address, pal," Paul growled. Mark chuckled, reaching into his jacket pocket. He pulled out not a weapon, but a folded legal document and a photograph. He handed the photo to William. It was a picture of Jennifer Williams' late wife, laughing at a cafe in Paris. Sitting across from her, holding her hand, was Mark, Jennifer, and I. "We had a summer," Mark said, his eyes gleaming with malice. "Right before she married you. The timing was tight, William. Very tight. I did the math. Those boys, the heterochromia." He tapped his own eye, which was a dull, flat hazel, but he pulled out a medical chart claiming his grandfather had the condition. "I'm here for my sons, William." The accusation hit William like a physical blow. He staggered back, clutching the photo. The timeline. Jennifer had gone to Paris for a month before the wedding to visit family. He had never questioned her loyalty, but the seed of doubt, planted by a charismatic stranger with a legal team behind him, began to take root instantly. Mark wasn't just claiming paternity. He was serving William with a court order for a mandatory DNA test, claiming the first one William had done was unsupervised and inadmissible in a custody hearing. Mark looked up at the loft where the boys were playing, unaware that their world was tilting on its axis. "Cute kids," Mark sneered. Paul saw the panic in William's eyes, the old, frozen panic of a man used to losing everyone he loved. Paul grabbed the legal papers from William's hand and got in Mark's face. "Get out," Paul whispered, the sound more terrifying than a shout. Mark laughed, checked his watch, and backed away. "I'll see you in court on Monday, Jones. Don't try to run." As the silver car peeled away, leaving a cloud of exhaust, William sank onto the bumper of the fire truck. He looked at Paul, his voice trembling. What if he's right? What if I stole them? The ghost of his insecurity was back, threatening to burn down the house they had built.